We are going to study some of the parables of Jesus. Jesus taught in several different ways, of course. Some of his teaching was what's called hortatory, or commandments, do this, don't do that. Not a lot of Jesus' teaching is that way, but some is definitely commands, hortatory type teaching. Some is basically sermons. That's the way we would tend to think of these things, as kind of sermons, like the Sermon on the Mount, talking about the nature of reality, what's really true, what's not true, and what that implication is for your life. That's essentially what sermons are about. But a great deal of Jesus' teaching, most of Jesus' teaching, is in the form of parables. Think of a parable as a story that makes a point. It's more than an illustration, but it's basically telling you a story that vividly makes a point come alive to you. And Jesus taught, most of his teaching probably is in parables of one form or another. Parables, these stories, I hesitate to use the word stories, so let me just say now, whenever I use the word stories, I mean stories that tell you true things. I don't mean stories as in fiction stories, right? Just that tell you things that are just adventures. And there's nothing wrong with fiction stories, but the stories Jesus told were to tell you true things. So when Jesus told these stories, I think he was brilliant in the sense that he realized stories are really, if you think about it, stories are the way we make sense of our lives, we frame our lives, and we tend to implement change in our lives based on stories. I'll give you a simple example and then I'll move on. But basically, if someone comes to you and says, you know what, if you would quit eating so much sugar, you'd feel better, so quit eating so much sugar. Well, of course, I ignore that. But that's not so good. But what if somebody comes to you and says, well, let me tell you about my friend who cut back on sugar and feels so much better, feels 20 years younger, looks better, teeth are whiter, got a better score on the SAT. And now I'm telling you a story and you're like, well, maybe I ought to think about cutting back on those cookies a little bit, you know? We, seriously, all joking aside, stories are the way we tend to frame things in our lives, and Jesus understood that better than anyone. So I want to talk to you in this lesson about how our faith impacts how we deal with possessions. We live in a materialistic society. I don't say that in a judgmental way. I simply say that if you just think about our society, we're very concerned with material things. Some of that is just part of being human and being alive. Some of that is just part of the way we're conditioned. So we tend to think about possessions a lot. That's not new. The interesting thing about Jesus' teaching about possessions, money, possessions, what do you do with them, how do you handle them, depending on your estimate, 25 to 40% of his parables are about this topic. Jesus had a lot to say about handling our possessions. Why is that? I would argue that it's because it's one of the great temptations to go wrong in our lives. I think Jesus loved us, and so he said, let me just focus primarily on the things that are most likely to take you off course and put your life into the ditch, if you will. So I want to talk about how we view possessions. The New Testament has a lot to say about it. One interesting thing, and this is what I posted on social media because I'm aware that there are people today, it's very popular today, not just today, but very much so today, to look at Jesus' teaching on wealth, money, possessions, whatever, and say, you know, Jesus really taught socialism. He taught the idea of everybody gets taken care of by everybody. And I think that's likely serving an end, and I'm going to suggest that we just go look for ourselves. And so what I'd like to do in this is pick 3 parables that I think are representative, that tell us some of the teaching of what Jesus had to say about our possessions. You know, my philosophy is to let the Bible be what it wants to be and say what it wants to say. It doesn't want to be a political primer. It doesn't want to be prescribing a particular political system. But what it does definitely want to say is it wants to talk about what should my attitudes be toward things, in this case, possessions. One of the probably best known introduction to this is this passage in Luke 16. And I put the whole passage in there because I think it's interesting. No servant can serve two masters, for he'll either hate the one and love the other, or he'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. In other words, we really don't do well with divided loyalties, right? The Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard these things, and they ridiculed him. And he said, "You are those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts. What is exalted among men is an abomination in the sight of God." And it sets the stage for so much of Jesus' teaching and the truth claim he's making, and that is a lot of what we think priority-wise in the world is upside down to God. And so the idea of loving money and the things that come from money is considered idolatry to God. Nowhere are you going to find the idea that possessions or money are inherently bad. That's not a biblical teaching at all. The question is, does it take a place of too high an importance in our lives? Does it become the big thing in our lives? I'll show you what I mean. The first parable I want to talk about is the parable of the rich fool. Now, these titles were given to this. That's not in the Bible. And so the rich fool is because of a particular word that's used in here. But it's a story that Jesus is telling. But I want you to see why he's telling this story. Here's the beginning. Someone in the crowd yelled out to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." In other words, we've got a family spat, and my brother is not being fair about dividing the inheritance of our family with me, and so maybe he'll listen to you because you're a holy man, so why don't you go tell him, divide the inheritance. And Jesus said, "Who made me a judge or arbitrator over you?" And he said to everyone around him, "Be very careful, be on your guard against greed or covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." That phrase is worth committing to memory. That is the fundamental approach of the Bible towards possessions. Are they good? Depends on how you use them. Are they evil? Not inherently so. They can be quite useful. They can be quite destructive. So it doesn't take, but one thing it does, it says, is be careful, be on your guard that you don't fall into believing that the abundance of your possessions defines your life. And that, I would say, in our Western world, in the prosperous world in which we live, is a temptation for us. That you slip into the idea that I begin to base my security, I begin to base my importance, I begin to fundamentally incorporate too much into my identity, my possessions. This idea is your life is more than the abundance of your possessions. Possessions are to be enjoyed, they're to be used, but they're not to be consuming. You own them, they don't own you, is a great way of thinking about it. Have you ever gotten to the point in your life where you had so much stuff and you realized, wait a minute, who's in charge here? You know, do I own this stuff or does this stuff own me? You know, you realize at some point this can get out of hand. I'm sure we've all had that experience. Jesus' fundamental teaching is be careful, because the desire for constantly to have more will lead you into thinking that the purpose of your life can be defined by this. Ecclesiastes said it this way: "He who loves money will never be satisfied with money." And by the way, you can replace the word money with any number of other things, right? He who loves money will never be satisfied, nor he who loves wealth will never be satisfied with his income. This also is vanity. That word vanity in Ecclesiastes is meaningless off the end, but I wrote it on the rest of the iPad. The idea of meaningless. When goods increase, they increase who eat them, and what advantage has their owner but to see them with his eyes? In other words, we came out of our mother's womb, and we shall go again, naked as we came. We take nothing that we may carry out of this life with us. Naked you came into the world, naked you're going to depart from the world. The fundamental idea there, I want you to see the Old Testament and the New Testament have this same attitude, is be careful of defining your life by anything that is ephemeral, anything that does not last. If we base our identity in anything that will not last, then our identity is built on. You remember the parable about building on the rock and building on the sand? Ephemeral things are like building on the sand. They can be removed anytime. So he told him a story. He said, I'm not here to judge between you, and I want to warn you guys, be careful. Your life consists of more than the abundance of your possessions. And to make his point, he told them a story. Here's the parable. The land of a certain rich man produced a lot, and he thought to himself, what shall I do, for I have nowhere to store my crops. I'm so prosperous. Well, of course, you rent a storage unit. That's what we do in America, right? He said, and that's what he does. He said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns, and I will build larger barns. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, now you have enough laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you foolish man. This is where the rich fool comes from. You foolish man, this very night your soul is required of you, and the things you prepared, who will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. The idea here is really a powerful truth. Jesus is just making a point that if you base your security, your identity, whatever, on ephemeral things, in this case, possessions, but you could replace this with any kind of ephemeral thing. He says at that point, given the uncertainty of life, you're building on sand. You're building on a foundation that can be pulled out from under you. The idea of living with the long view, living in light of eternity, is really the biblical idea. In other words, when you ask yourself, what should I do with my fame? What should I do with my fortune? What should I do with my health? What should I do with any of the things that I have? The answer should be, what would be the eternal perspective on these things? That will always be God's view. Because God doesn't take the short view, he takes the long view. Here's a great way to summarize this parable. I want to give you a couple of examples. This is Jim Elliot. Some of you may know the story of Jim Elliot, and his wife is probably even more famous to us now, Elizabeth Elliot. He said this, and it's probably one of the most profound things I've said, that I've seen. But this is this parable. He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. Don't you think that's clever? That is this parable. That is a one-line summary. You're not a foolish person if you give up what you cannot possibly keep. Possessions are not something that you will take with you to gain something that you cannot possibly lose. And that's why the parable says, so will be anyone who is rich in goods but not rich toward God. It's a brilliant way of saying it. By the way, this is the movie. If you're not familiar with this story, this is a great movie, and it is such an inspiring story in so many ways. St. Augustine, back in the 4th century AD, said it this way, and I've always thought this was a very clever way to summarize this. He is commenting on this parable. The rich man did not realize that the bellies of the poor were safer storerooms than his barns. Isn't that interesting? What is he saying again? He's saying, live with that eternal view. In other words, instead of putting them in the barn for me to use, it would be safer to put them in the bellies of the poor. This is the idea of building up treasure in heaven. So you get this sense here, it's not that there's a bad thing to have possessions. The question comes, what will we do with them? The idea of what's our perspective on how to use them. Sirach, this is not in the Bible. This is extra biblical, but I wanted you to see this idea is very common throughout Jewish and Christian history. One becomes rich through diligence and self-denial, and the reward allotted to him is this. When he says, I found rest and now I shall feast, he does not know how long it will be until he leaves them to others and dies. All through wisdom literature, and you'll even see this in non-biblical wisdom literature, is this realization that life is short. So don't make decisions that are completely focused on the brevity of your life. This passage in Timothy is one I want to camp out on for a second because it really hits another element. So one element of this parable is the idea of living for the longer view. Again, like I say, the idea that giving up what you can't possibly keep to gain something you can't possibly lose is a really, really good investment. This passage highlights something else. It says, godliness with contentment and I want to focus on that word, is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of the world. You're hearing the same theme. But if we have food and clothing, with these we will be content. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin. For the love of money is the root of many kinds of evils. And by the way, substitute something else in there for money if you want to. The love of anything ephemeral will end up causing you great pain. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many, many troubles. But as for you, O man of God, flee these things. Pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, steadfastness, and gentleness. This really brings up an interesting question when you talk about wealth. In and of itself, it's neither good nor bad. The question is, how will I use it? What's my perspective? Short-term perspective tends to lead to difficulties. Long-term perspective, the idea of investing what you have, whether it's money, time, talents, whatever it may be, is the approach. The second big thing, as you think about this, how do I know then? Here's the interesting question. So Terry, I get that, and we are all wealthy. I mean, relatively speaking. Out of the 9 billion people in the world, 8.99 billion of them would trade places with you today. I mean, so in that sense, we are all very fortunate. We are all wealthy, relatively speaking. So given that we have that, your point is, yes, I do want to enjoy some of it. I need to use some of it, but I want to invest. How do I balance that? This kind of gives you an interesting insight into that. This word contentment is translated several ways. I'm going to tell you several places in the Bible you'll see this. Contentment is the idea of having enough, the idea of being sufficient. I'm going to give you some other passages so you'll get the sense of this idea of contentment. Philippians 4:11, Paul says, I have learned in whatever circumstance I find myself to be content. I know what it is to not have enough, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret in any and every circumstance to be content. So the idea is my contentment does not rely on the abundance of my possessions. Are you hearing the parable again? Here's another place it's used. In 2 Corinthians 12, Paul talks about, he said, I was given a thorn in the flesh. He had some physical ailment. Paul healed people through the power of the Holy Spirit. So he prays to God 3 times to heal him. He said, Lord, heal me so I can, go preach more. And God said, my grace is sufficient for you. That's this word. In other words, be content with your disability, because my grace is enough for you. My grace is sufficient for you. And Paul says, well, in that case, I'll just boast about my disability. He said, because when I'm weak, then I'm very strong. See this upside down? The key here is, and this is one I would challenge us with, is if you can answer the question, what is enough? Then you have answered the question of, what do I keep? What do I invest? In fact, if you can answer that question, you have become free of possessions. You know that you are in danger of being enslaved by your possessions if you cannot answer that question. Now, to be fair, admit that's a hard question, isn't it? Many people would say, what's sufficient? A little bit more. Then you ask them later, what's sufficient? A little bit more. And that's called greed. I mean, we tend to think of greed as just this grimy thing. Greed is simply the idea of not knowing what's enough, not knowing what's sufficient, not knowing when I can be content. Does this make sense? And if you're listening to this, you start to realize, wait a minute, this is about a lot more than money. Yes, it is. Jesus' teaching about money and possessions isn't actually about money and possessions. It's actually asking us the question, do you know what is enough? Do you know what it means to be content? And I think it's interesting that in Philippians 4, Paul says, I have learned the secret of being content. He didn't say, I'm just a holy man and I know. I'm sorry, you're not holy enough and you don't know. That's not the situation. He said, I have learned what is enough. And I know some of you in the course of your life would say, I too have learned what is enough. And I've also learned what's too much. I hate to tell you this, most of us, me included, learned what was enough by first experiencing what was too much, right? And so this idea of contentment, of sufficiency, of enough, that is the key to balancing it. Because spending and enjoying the things God has given you isn't a bad thing, and clearly investing what God has given you for eternal purposes is an extremely good thing. I think where most of us as Christians who understand that come now, where is my balance? And I think the key is answering that question. The Jewish sages also wrestled with this, and they kind of came at it from this point of view, and that is, how do I keep myself from wanting too much? When do I learn that I have enough? How can I get there? And this is a great little saying. They would say, put a fence around your temptations, if you will. And tradition is a fence for the Torah. Tithes are a fence for wealth. Vows are a fence for abstinence, and a fence for wisdom is silence. But the idea there is, and if you've ever wondered, why does God, I'll just explain this right now, why does God ask you to give money? Why do the Jews were instructed to tithe? Christians are instructed to more than tithe. It's not legalistic anymore. It's like you can just give everything besides what's enough, right? Seriously. It's 10% is, it's not just a 10% rule. It's like, well, you could give 90 if you want to, right? So the idea of tithing, giving is not because God needs your money. The reason for that is I need to recognize it's God's money. It's God's stuff. And I think that's helping me learn what's enough. If I have a hard time saying I'm going to take some of the first and the best of what God has given me and give it to God, if I have a hard time with that, that's a sign to me that I'm struggling with what's enough. I'm struggling with this idea. And that's God saying, that's what I really want to get to. The whole idea of giving in church is not about the money. It's about faith. It's about growing us. It's about helping us to learn what's enough. Many of you, when your kids were little, they would go and they would give money at church. You did that for several reasons. One of the reasons you did it was to develop discipline. One of it is to develop a tradition so they would learn the discipline of giving. But one of the reasons is that as a kid, think about if you're a little kid and you've got $1 in your hand. You realize you're keenly aware of just how much candy that will buy. And then going to church and putting that in, that's it, to a little kid, that's like, I just gave away some of the best things in life. That was candy I could have had. That's part of why you do that as an adult, is to help train that. You're putting a fence around greed, wealth, self-indulgence. That's really the idea of tithing. And the Jews understood that. It's a way of helping us get to the idea of what's enough. Timothy again says, as for those who have rich in this present age, and that's all of us, relatively speaking, charge them not to be too proud, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches. You hearing the same idea again? You don't, it's an ephemeral thing. It can be taken away at any time. But instead on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. They are to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous, ready to share, thus storing up their treasure as a good foundation for the future in heaven. That's back to the idea that you give up something you can't keep to gain something you can't possibly lose. So this parable of the rich fool is not so much about the rich fool. It's not so much about you made a bad business decision. I mean, if you could read that and just say, yeah, it was a bad decision. You should have gone to the doctor first, and realized you were about to die. That's not what this parable is about. The parable is about the idea of making decisions on that short-term basis, not realizing investing it, and then, of course, never knowing what's enough. Ecclesiastes, again, more wisdom around this thing. Sweet is the sleep of a laborer, whether he eats little or much, but the full stomach of the rich will not let him sleep. What's this saying? Who owns the possessions? You, or do they own you? In other words, there are obligations that come with these things. Whoever is this is probably one of my favorite proverbs. Think about this for a minute. Whoever is generous to the poor lends to the Lord, and the Lord will repay him for his deed. Do you remember Augustine saying the bellies of the poor were a better place to put his money than in his barns? Lending to the Lord is a really good deal. I mean, think about that. What a graphic way to think about storing up treasure in heaven. Because I think when we hear that phrase, storing up treasure in heaven, that's kind of hard to visualize. I like this way of visualizing it. Everything that you share is as though you lent it to the Lord. Do you think he will give it back? I'm really pretty sure he will give it back. Does that make sense? Think of it that way. That's a very concrete way. Everything we do, the generosity we have is like lending to the Lord. Let's go on to the second parable. Let's look at a slightly different angle on this idea of possessions. I picked three that are different, that highlight different angles. So we've talked about the idea of live with an eternal perspective, the idea of investing what you've been given for eternal gain, and then the idea of how do I know what's enough? In other words, the idea of navigating that, the idea of navigating almost anything in life is understanding where does contentment lie? What's sufficient for me? If you can't answer that question, then we don't actually know. Parable of the talents is an interesting parable. Jesus said it will be like a man who went on a journey, and he called his servants, and he entrusted to them his property. So this is pretty obvious who's who in here. The man going on the journey is God, and the people who've been entrusted with things are us. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. Now, this is kind of unfortunate today. We read the word talent and we think ability, capability, and this parable makes perfect sense in that context. But it's not what it originally meant. In the Old Testament, a talent was a measure of weight, and a talent was about 75 pounds or so. In New Testament times, a talent was a measure of money. And to put it in contrast today, it was about 6,000 drachmas, Roman drachmas, which would have been about 20 years of labor for a day laborer, minimum wage. I mean, that's a lot of money. And so today it'd be, $300,000, $400,000, something like that. I mean, we're talking about a ton of money here. So to one of them, he gives 5 talents, so that's $1.5 million, let's say. To another, he gives 2, and the other 1 according to his ability, and then he went away. Now, he who had received the 5 talents went up once and traded with them. He put them to work, and he made 5 talents more. So also the one that had 2 made 2 talents more. But the one who received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Now this, by the way, is not a parable about smart investing. That's not what this parable is about. You're going to find out in a second, it doesn't make any difference how much money they made on that. That's not the point of the parable at all. Okay? Now, after a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts. And the one who had received 5 talents came forward. He brought 5, saying, Master, you gave me this, and here, look what I've done with it. What the point here is, what have you done with it? How have you used it? He said, I used it to make some more. And he said, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a little. I'm going to give you even more. Enter into the joy of your master. He who had the 2 talents came, and notice, exactly the same reward. He says, Master, you gave me 2, and I put it to work. Master said, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a little. I'll set you over much. Exactly the same reward. He also, who had received the 1 talent, came forward and said, I knew that you were a hard man, and I knew that you would punish me if I lost money. And so basically, I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, you have what is yours. So 2 things going on in this parable. Number 1, the obvious thing is one person used what they were given, 2 of them did, and 1 person didn't do anything with it. And so there's a sense that God has an expectation that you do something with what he has given you. How much? This parable would indicate that there's no answer to that question, how much? Well, if you make, a 20% return, is that good? if you help 10 needy people, is that enough? Wrong question. The Bible never answers that question. The Bible only says, go use it. We were called to be faithful, not successful. In other words, we'll use our abilities as best we can. We'd like to help as many people as we can, but that's not the barometer of God's success, is were you faithful to use it? What's the problem with the other servant? Not faithful to use it. And it's a little deeper, because notice what he says. He says, you wicked and slothful servant. That's an interesting reaction to someone who basically just didn't use what you gave them. So let me tell you what's actually going on here. So the first two people, and what he says to him, notice what he said. You could have at least put it in the bank and earned 0.037% interest on a checking account, right? And his point would have been, and that would have been fine. What would have happened if you come back and said, I only made a little bit? He would have said, well done, good and faithful servant, enter into the joy of your master, because you used what I gave you. He didn't use it. And so that's problem number one. Problem number two is deeper, and this should scare us a little bit. He says, you wicked servant. Why is he wicked? Okay, so follow me on this. This is what's really going on in this. So the two guys, they go put the talents in the investments. One guy buries it in the ground. Not uncommon in those days for the master to go off on a journey and the master to not come back. Get beaten up by robbers, get sick, and die. I mean, it wasn't unheard of at all. So what happens if the master goes away, apparently for a long time, and he doesn't come back? And he gets declared legally dead, or word comes back, well, he was waylaid by bandits and he was killed and he's dead. What happens to the 5 talents? Probate, right? It says, oh, there's your assets, go get his will, let's go pass that on. What happens to the 2 talents? Probate. What happens to the 1 talent? Belongs to that guy now, because he just hid it in the ground. Do you understand this idea of why he was wicked? He was not faithful because he didn't use it. He was wicked because he kept it for himself, and that should scare us. I think about that because every one of us have been given talents. Now I'm going to do a word play. I'm not going to talk about our money anymore. I'm going to talk about the gifts we've been given. Abilities, contacts, status, whatever we've been given. The idea is those things are given to us to use, some for our enjoyment, some for our benefit, but also to invest, right, for eternal purposes. If I take that and I use it for myself, what am I doing? I buried it. This guy's wicked because he knows there's a chance the master won't come back, and if he doesn't, I get to keep it. It's all about me and mine. And that's another interesting angle. I mean, so far it's been positive, and that is invest what God's given you, use what God has given you. This is more of a beware hoarding what God has given you and using it for yourself. That's like stealing something God gave you. He calls him a wicked servant because he intended to steal that. Does that make sense? And if you think about that for a minute and apply it, Jesus is saying some pretty profound things here about these talents and about these possessions, and that is, not only are you wise to use it, store up treasures in heaven, lend to God, if you will, but keeping it for yourself is like stealing from the one who gave it to you. Does that make sense? The last one I want to tell you is the story of rich man and Lazarus. So we've got the idea of investing what God has given you. The key idea is not about the money. It's about my attitude and what I'm going to do with it. What I'm going to do with it depends a lot on whether I can answer the question of what is enough in my life. Otherwise, I'm always going to struggle with this. It's always going to be, is it mine or is it yours? One time, I told the story about preachers in little churches in a town. There was this little town. They had 3 churches. The churches were all little, and each had a pastor, and the pastors knew each other. They'd talk, and they'd share information and challenges about their parishioners, and what do you do here, and how do you handle this? And one of them, one day, they were having coffee, and he said, you know, here's my problem is I don't have a salary for my church. We're too little. I take out of the offering, some of that goes to run the church and some of that goes for my livelihood. How do you guys decide how much, should go to us and how much should go to the church? That's kind of our question, isn't it? I've been given this. How much do I side? I enjoy some of it, but how much do I invest? They were struggling, and one guy says, well, I rely on the Holy Spirit. He said, what I basically do is I draw a circle and I stand in the middle and I toss it up, and whatever lands in that circle is mine, and whatever lands outside that circle is God's. The other guy says, I do something very similar because it's hard to answer that question. I just draw a line, stand in the middle, throw it up, and what comes down on one side is mine, and what comes down on the other side is God's. And the other guy's just sipping his coffee, and they said, well, what about you? I mean, do you not struggle with this? He said, I do, but I have a little different method than you guys do. And he said, well, what do you do? He said, I do the same thing, actually. I take it and I throw it up, and I just assume he will keep whatever he wants. So if it comes down, then it's mine. We always struggle with this idea, don't we? This concept of what's mine and what's his. Easy way to answer that, it's all his. And you've just been entrusted with it. Be faithful. What does being faithful mean, Terry? Use it. How much do I have to use it? Bible never answers that question. How much good do I have to do? Bible never answers that question. You're saved by grace, not by your good deeds. But go use it. Does that make sense? How freeing is that? I mean, it's not as freeing as I get to keep it all, but you know what? That's really bad for us. That kind of self-centeredness, self-indulgent will kill you, literally. The idea of, I just need to go be generous. I get to decide what's enough. God's not going to micromanage that. And so how freeing is that? Just go be faithful. Tell you another story. This is a true story, and I'll make it kind of short, but this is one of my favorite stories about John Wesley. You may remember John Wesley, 18th century revival, great preacher, founder of Methodism. Wouldn't recognize it today, but he's founder of Methodism. Sorry if that offended anybody, but it's true. So John Wesley, and I'm not trying to say this to shame us, I'm simply trying to say in this, okay, he gets this. He gets the idea. I'm not saying you have to do what he did, but he gets the idea. So he was a man of simple means, and he was a traveling preacher, and he just didn't need much. And so according to his records, 1 year he lived on 5 pounds English, okay? So 5 pounds of income, and he lived on that year. And he didn't make very much money. He made a few pounds more than that. So he lived on 5 and he gave away 3. And then he starts writing these books and all, and he makes more money. But he actually didn't change his lifestyle. He still lived on 5 pounds, but he made 30. So he gave away 25. And then he got audited. And they audited him because he only reported on his income taxes that he had 2 pieces of silver. In those days, you had to declare your possessions. And he would have a silver spoon and a silver fork, right? And they go, a guy who makes as much money as you are can't possibly only have that much assets. So they come and they audit him and they realize, oh my gosh, that's all the assets the guy's got. Why do you do that? He goes, it's all I need. And so the story of him, I'm making this a little shorter, but the story is, as his income went up, his living expenses didn't go up nearly as much. He ends up giving away 90% or more of what he makes. And I'm not telling you that, oh, if you want to be holy, you better do that. That is not even slightly the point of this story, right? It's about being faithful. My point is, there's a guy who answered the question, what is enough? Now, what if your answer is 90% is enough and I tithe 10? That's a good answer. You just need to have an answer. For him, it was, well, I know what's enough to live on, so anything else, well, by all means, I will lend that to the Lord, right? So my point, again, is not to shame us or tell you you've got to be holy like that, because that's not what holiness is. The point is if you can answer that question, then it's easy to be faithful. Just use the rest for God, okay? The story of the rich man and Lazarus has a little different angle to it. There was a rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen, Jesus said, and he feasted every day, okay? And at his gate was laid a poor man named Lazarus. He was covered with sores, and he desired simply to have what fell from the rich man's table. He would love to have the scraps. Moreover, even the dogs came and licked his sores. So Jesus is telling this story, and he's dramatizing this to make this, here's a man living in sumptuous wealth, which, by the way, is not condemned. And here's Lazarus, who's poor, which also is not condemned. I mean, we have sympathy for him, but it doesn't mean he's not holy. He's not a godly man. Those are his circumstances. The irony here, and I just want to point this out, his name Lazarus is Eleazar. Eleazar means God is my helper. How ironic is that? By the way, have you noticed so far in these parables how few people are ever named in a parable? No one has a name because it's a story, and it's not about a person, it's about an idea, and you go, oh, I see what you're saying. Generosity, invest with an eternal point of view. I see what you're trying to tell me. This is one of the very, very few times you actually see a name, and when you see it, it's ironic, isn't it? It's like, well, that's kind of a laugh. That's sarcastic, isn't it? Here's Lazarus, whose name means God helps. Watch how God turns this upside down, which is what God does with everything. And the rabbis taught, by the way, there are 3 men whose lives are not counted as worth living. He who is dependent on the table of his neighbor, well, that's Lazarus. He whose wife dominates over him, not Lazarus' problem. Not many girls want to go out with Lazarus. And he who has bodily suffering, that's Lazarus as well. The rabbis said, because the Jewish understanding of that is, if you're Lazarus, God must not like you. And how ironic is it that your name means God likes me? God is my help, right? James Boyce says this, it's important to remember there's nothing here or anywhere else in this parable that condemns the rich man for being rich or praises the poor man for being poor. Unlike the Jewish idea that if you're rich, God must like you, and if you're poor, God must not. And the New Testament says that's not even slightly true at all. So the poor man died. Lazarus died, and he was carried by angels to Abraham's side. And the rich man also died, and he was buried, and he was in Hades. He was tormented. And he lifted up his eyes, and he saw Abraham far off, and he saw Lazarus laying there. And he said, Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus to dip the end of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in anguish in this flame. By the way, this is a parable, this is a story, but this is where your idea about the fires of hell, this is one of the places that comes from, is from this parable. But Abraham said, child, remember that in your lifetime you received your good things. That's interesting. It's not so much that he had good things in his lifetime, but he used all his good things in his lifetime, didn't he? He said, but poor Lazarus here, in like manner, he had bad things, but now he's comforted here, and you are in anguish. Besides, there's a great chasm between us, and no one can cross from one side to the other. So you see here kind of this role reversal. This isn't teaching what the Jews thought, that rich people are blessed and poor people are not. It's also not teaching the opposite, that poor people are blessed, and by the nature of being poor, you're going to heaven. By the nature of being rich, you're going to hell. You're going to see in just a second the cutting point of this, okay? And he said, then I beg you, send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, so he may warn them that they may also, lest they also come to this place of torment. And Abraham said, they have the Bible, let them read it. And he said, no, but if someone goes to them from the dead, then maybe they'll actually change their mind. And he said, if they will not read the Bible, Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced that someone should rise from the dead. So at least you get the sense that the rich man said, I used up everything you gave me, and I have nothing that's invested for eternity. At least go tell my brothers not to be a rich fool like me, a foolish rich person like me. Lazarus, on the other hand, is not living high and mighty. Lazarus is being comforted by God. God turns things around. The interesting lesson to me out of this parable is, in the first parable, you get the idea of the key is how you look at what you have. What's my attitude towards what I have? In other words, it is for my enjoyment. and it is to be invested for eternity. You know, like the old poem says, only what's done for Christ will last. In other words, don't invest everything you have. Don't entrust yourself to ephemeral things. The idea of knowing what's enough. Then you come to the second parable and you get the idea of using what you have. Well, do I have to be really smart? Don't have to be smart. Do I have to be successful? Don't have to be successful. What do I have to be? Faithful. Just go use what you have to do good. I think I've told you this story before. My Mother Teresa, who many of you like me would say that's a level of commitment in her life. She took a vow of poverty, she took a vow of chastity, lived her entire life amongst the poor in Calcutta. It's called Calcutta in those days. Amongst Calcutta, amidst the dying, against the poorest of the poor. And the Sisters of Mercy would eat what the poor ate, and they just lived that lifestyle, and they ministered to the poor. Well, you think to yourself, well, how can anybody have heartburn with that? Talk about not knowing what's enough and being willing to invest your time and whatever you have for people that have even less than she had, right? They said, how could you critique that? And yet she was bitterly critiqued. She was critiqued because she wasn't being successful enough. In other words, by going and living with the poor, feeding them, living like the poor, comforting them when they were dying, talking about Christ when they were living, you weren't actually eradicating poverty. And by the way, that's true. I don't think she ever eradicated anybody's poverty. What did she do? She just fed whoever showed up and was hungry. But she didn't eradicate poverty. In the Western world, we have this idea that your value is tied to how much you produce, how successful you are. And so the critique of her was, well, you may be a really nice person, and you may be doing something that none of us are willing to do, and yet you're not successful. You're not eradicating poverty. And that's where she coined this phrase, I was not called to be successful, I was called to be faithful. And that's where I would caution us, is God doesn't call us and say, I've given you these gifts, talents, these giftings of yours. Now, you can go to heaven if you do good enough with them, right? If you do well enough, if you're successful enough, you can go to heaven. That's not the message of Jesus' teaching at all. Jesus' teaching isn't that, by the way, if you can eradicate poverty, then you've done well enough and you're a good Christian. You can go to heaven. This is where you kind of rebut this idea of Jesus was a socialist. Jesus wanted us to take care of people, but Jesus never said the idea that they never even expected that your job is to cure world hunger. Your job is to feed whoever comes across your path. Your job is to go fill the bellies of the poor. Your job is to use what you've been given to use. You're called to be faithful. You're not called to be successful. God will make it successful when and how God chooses to make it successful. But we are only accountable to make it, to be faithful. The problem with Lazarus and the rich man is the rich man, once again, he used everything he had for himself. So you get this sense of self-indulgence with him. And consequently, this parable isn't so much about you were wicked, it's just you had your good things and you used them all up. And you have nothing here, a la Jesus talking about store up treasures in heaven, if you will. You have that sense here of this not happening. And probably one of the greatest practical lessons out of this, out of all the things we've talked about, and I think there are some really, hopefully you take something out of this and think about it a little bit, and let one of these stories begin to shape how you think about your life. But the interesting thing for you and me, and the question that haunts me, and not in a bad way, but that I ask myself a lot is, who is sitting at your gate? Who is sitting at your and my gate? Because there's no evidence this rich man ever thought twice about Lazarus. And who is it in my life that I don't even think twice about? Who's sitting at my gate? And it is in my power to be of some help to them, and I simply don't think about being of help to them. This is the guilt-inducing part, but I don't really mean it to be guilt-inducing. I simply think that's what Jesus is asking us in this parable. Is this parable about the nature of heaven and hell? Not really. Is this parable about, can you talk to people from heaven and hell? Not really. What is this parable fundamentally about? It's about how will you use what you have been given? But even more than that, the point of this parable is, to the rich man is, why didn't you ever notice Lazarus was there? He only wanted what you were throwing away. And I turn that around and I think, well, if Jesus were here telling me this parable, he's probably telling me this because he loves me, but he's probably asking me that question. Terry, I want you to pay a little more attention because there might be somebody sitting at your gate that it's easily in your power to be of help to them. Does that make sense? That, to me, is the great takeaway from this. And the parables need to be not just learning, they need to be things that begin to shape our reality, begin to say, I think that story is going to lead me to alter the way I think about my possessions, and I think it's going to help me alter the way I use my possessions. Socialism, coming full circle to that, is where somebody takes your stuff and gives it to the people that they think need it. Okay, well, that could be good, never has been good, but I suppose theoretically could be good. But the point of Jesus is there's no coercion in any of these stories. It doesn't mean anything if it's taken from you. You can't be faithful. Let me put it this way, there's no virtue in being forced to help someone. Make sense? That's why Jesus is not a socialist. This is not a political statement, but the fundamental premise of that is forced redistribution. Now, you could argue whether that's a good idea or a bad idea, and that's fine. That's more of a political structure argument. But Jesus bypasses that, and he said, actually, if you're made to do it, then it's not faithful. The key is, I'll give it to you, and I'll let you decide. Now, will you be faithful, or will you use it? The rich man and Lazarus said, I think I'm going to use it all for me. And God said, and then this is what the consequence of that is. This is what the consequence is of not being faithful, not looking around and sharing. It would have been fine if the rich man said, 98% is enough for me. Anything would have been better in this situation. The man with one talent, if he said, I took a little piece of it and I invested it, fine. The problem with this is there's no faithfulness. Faithfulness is the currency of God, not success, not the amount of money. And so think about your money, your talents, your gifts and all as being things God's given you to allow you to trade in the currency of faithfulness. Just go do something faithful with what we have. Okay? That's your assignment this week. Because next week's harder. Next week, this is easy. Did I tell you we started with the easy one? Next time, I want to talk to you about the second most often given parable of Jesus, and it's forgiveness. Next week, you're going to be going, can we go back to giving because I've decided to tithe more, okay? So next week, the hard part, but this week, in all seriousness, I can't answer this question for you. I'm not accusing you of anything, but just go do something faithful. I'll see you next time.